The air in Roanoke is thick, thick with whispers, thick with secrets, thick with the unsettling feeling that something ancient and unknown still lingers just beneath the surface. For centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony has left historians, archaeologists, and thrill-seekers alike tangled in its dark mystery. What happened to the 117 men, women, and children who vanished without a trace in 1587? No bodies, no bones, just a cryptic word etched into a tree, Croatoan, and a colony abandoned in the dead of night. Were they taken by the native tribes, slaughtered by the elements, or did they simply walk into the very shadows that still stretch across the North Carolina coast? Whatever the truth is, it sits like a curse over Roanoke, clinging to its very soul, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to unearth it. And as the winds howl through the trees and the waves crash against the shores of that forsaken island, one thing becomes clear. The mystery of Roanoke is far from over. It's only just begun. It was a warm summer morning in 1587 when the settlers of the Roanoke colony first arrived. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden beams across the rippling waters of the Outer Banks. The salty air smelled of brine and freedom, a sharp contrast to the suffocating confines of England that they had left behind. For these 117 men, women, and children, Roanoke Island represented a new beginning. It was to be their promised land, a place where they could escape the rigid social structures of Europe and build a life free from the tyranny of their homeland. But what they found, what they built, would become a living nightmare, one that would echo through the centuries and still haunt anyone who dared to search for its truth. The settlers worked with urgency. They were weary from their long journey, but the promise of a fresh start pushed them onward. They built crude homes from the thick timber that surrounded them, hammering and sawing with raw determination. The landscape was strange and wild, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. It was a world untamed, filled with strange noises that echoed through the dense woods, unfamiliar birds calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through leaves that seemed to murmur secrets. And at night, there were shadows, the kind of shadows that seemed to shift and move, like something living just out of sight. For the first few months, things were tolerable. They traded with the Croatoan tribe, whose members had lived on the island for generations, and exchanged food and goods. There were moments of camaraderie, of laughter around the campfires. But there was always an underlying tension, an unspoken discomfort. The Croatoans, although friendly, were also cautious, perhaps too cautious. Some of the settlers began to notice that their native neighbors never ventured too far from the shore, that they always seemed to watch the newcomers with strange, unreadable eyes. And the land itself, it seemed to resist them. The soil was fertile enough, but crops failed. Even the most seasoned farmers couldn't coax anything to grow. The settlers were forced to hunt and fish for survival, but the land offered little in return. As the days turned to weeks, the unease began to set in. Some of the settlers spoke in hushed tones around their campfires of things they had seen, figures moving between the trees, shapes that seemed to flicker in the corners of their eyes, the inexplicable sound of footsteps in the night. At first, they dismissed it as fatigue, as the madness brought on by isolation. But there was something about the island that made even the most hardened among them uneasy. The way the wind seemed to sigh through the trees, like a voice just out of reach. The strange sense that they were being watched, always watched. As the weeks stretched on, the colony grew desperate. The men and women began to quarrel, their nerves frayed by hunger, isolation, and fear. The once hopeful dream of building a new life turned to a grim survival struggle. And then, as if on cue, the first death came. It wasn't a violent one. No one knew exactly what had happened. But one of the settlers, a young man named John, was found dead in his tent. There were no wounds on his body, no sign of trauma. It was as if he had simply stopped breathing, his life snuffed out without explanation. It was the first of many. Days turned into weeks, and the settlers grew more and more anxious. Something was terribly wrong, but none could say what it was. And then came the disaster that no one could have foreseen. The ships that had promised to bring supplies, to replenish the colony's dwindling stores, never returned. Governor John White, who had been chosen to lead the settlement, was forced to return to England for help. The journey across the Atlantic took longer than expected, and by the time he returned to Roanoke 3 years later, the island had been swallowed by silence. The camp was empty. The homes stood like ghosts of the past, their roofs sagging, the doors swinging in the wind. Tools were left on the ground, as though the settlers had just stepped away for a moment. But there were no bodies, no sign of the people who had once called the island home. The only clue was a single word, carved into a tree, Croatoan. It was the name of an island to the south, where the Croatoan tribe lived. But why would they go there? The settlers had no reason to leave, no reason to abandon their homes in such a sudden and eerie fashion. And there were no signs that they had been forced to leave. No signs of a struggle, no bloodshed, just an eerie emptiness, as though the entire colony had simply evaporated into the air. Governor White searched the island desperately, hoping to find any trace of the people who had vanished. He sailed to the nearby Croatoan island, but found no sign of the settlers there either. He returned to Roanoke, hoping for something, anything, that might explain their disappearance. But there was nothing, no bodies, no remnants, just the word Croatoan carved into the tree, and the whispering winds that seemed to mock him as he searched in vain. The mystery of Roanoke had deepened. Had the settlers simply abandoned their homes, leaving for a new life on Croatoan Island, or had something far darker happened to them? The more White searched, the more questions there were. And as the years passed, the mystery of Roanoke became not just a story, but a legend, a dark and twisting tale that no one could fully understand, but one that everyone feared to unravel. The settlers of Roanoke did not just disappear. They vanished into the very fabric of history, leaving behind a riddle that still haunts the island to this day. The word Croatoan became a symbol of uncertainty, a clue that led to more questions than answers. It was as though the very island itself had swallowed the colony whole, hiding its secrets beneath layers of time and earth. The truth, whatever it may be, was lost, hidden somewhere in the shadows of Roanoke. But there were whispers that perhaps the island itself was cursed, or that something far older, far more sinister, had taken the settlers. Those who returned to Roanoke, those who dared to venture into its dark and silent woods, spoke of strange lights in the sky, of ghostly figures moving through the trees at night, of shadows that stretched long after the sun had set. Some said they had seen things, heard things, that should not have been possible, and some, broken and mad, swore they could still feel the presence of the lost colony, a haunting echo of their final moments, still hanging in the air. No one knew for sure what had happened to Roanoke, but one thing was certain. The island had become a place of darkness, a place that no one could escape from, and no one dared to understand. The years following the disappearance of the Roanoke colony were marked by a deep and unsettling silence. It wasn't just the empty island that spoke volumes. It was the very air, thick with mystery, that haunted the survivors and the explorers who ventured into that forsaken land. The story of Roanoke had been woven into the fabric of early American history, but it was a story with no beginning, no end, just a gaping hole where once there had been life. And with that hole came an eerie sense of something lurking, something that neither time nor distance could erase. For the next several decades, Roanoke Island sat in the background of history. The disappearance became fodder for speculation and half-hearted theories. Was it the Native Americans? Perhaps the settlers had angered the Croatoans, who, in turn, had wiped them out? Or perhaps disease had come for them, slowly, quietly, until the colony was swallowed up in its own decay. Maybe they'd left on their own, tired of their miserable existence, driven mad by isolation, starvation, and fear. These theories became the accepted truths, even though none could explain the strange word Croatoan left behind on the tree. It didn't sit right with anyone. It wasn't enough to satisfy the burning question, where did they go? The first expeditions back to Roanoke Island were greeted with disappointment. Men who had heard stories of the lost colony's treasure, its riches, its untold secrets, came looking for something, anything, to explain the disappearance. They found nothing. No bones, no bodies, no clues, just the wind, whistling through the dense trees and the gnawing feeling that they were not alone. And always, just out of sight, were the shadows. Some of these men would later return home, broken and wild-eyed, speaking in cryptic tones about what they had seen. Those who made the mistake of venturing deeper into the woods of Roanoke reported strange sights. At dusk, they saw flickering lights in the trees, lights that couldn't possibly have been made by human hands. They followed those lights, thinking they would lead them to an answer. But what they found instead were the remnants of old campsites, decayed shelters, long-abandoned fire pits, and symbols carved into the trees. Symbols that no one could read. And yet, these men swore they felt eyes upon them, eyes that followed them with a deep and unsettling hunger, as if the island itself were alive, watching, waiting. The land felt ancient in a way no one could explain. It wasn't just the silence, it was the stillness. It was as though the world had forgotten this place, and in turn, the place had forgotten the world. No birds sang, no insects hummed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But the strangest thing of all, the trees that towered above everything, their twisted limbs like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. The settlers had believed the trees were a part of the land's power. But now, explorers saw them differently. They saw them as watchful, sentient, as though they were marking the boundaries of something forbidden, something far darker than the island's natural beauty. There were whispers that the trees themselves knew the truth of what had happened to the colony, but they weren't speaking. Then came the rumors, the first whispers of a new theory. The settlers hadn't been killed by disease or hunger. They hadn't been taken by the Croatoans either. Some said the settlers had simply walked away, vanished into the very woods that surrounded them, but not because they were running from starvation or sickness. No, the rumors whispered of something much more sinister. What if the settlers had been taken, not by men or by disease, but by the land itself? The theories began to grow darker with each passing year. Perhaps the island had a strange power, something ancient, something that reached into the souls of those who dared to settle there. It was an island that no one truly understood, an island that seemed to resist human intervention. And as more time passed, the more the story of Roanoke became not just a mystery, but a curse. Every decade brought new expeditions, new theories, new attempts to solve the riddle of Roanoke. Some of these expeditions were formal, backed by the power of England, who had lost its colony in the New World. Others were private ventures, driven by curiosity or greed. But no matter who went or how they searched, they found only more questions. And then came the strange sightings. People who hadn't set foot on Roanoke for years, men and women who had heard the old legends and turned away, began to talk. Talk about what they had seen in the years after the colony's disappearance. Those who had sailed by the island spoke of strange lights flickering at night, of shadows moving in the water that couldn't be explained. Fishermen spoke of voices carried on the wind, calling out from the forest, calling out as if the lost colony was still alive, still waiting to be found. These stories were dismissed at first, just old men's ramblings, things that could be easily explained away by tired minds. But as the years passed and more people began to report strange experiences, there was a growing fear that perhaps there was something more to the stories, something far darker. And as that fear grew, so did the whispers that the island itself was cursed, that anyone who tried to uncover its secrets would suffer the same fate as the colony before them. And perhaps, just perhaps, those whispers were true. No one could explain the mystery of Roanoke. No one could say for certain what had happened to the settlers. But as more stories surfaced, and as more people vanished into the island's shadows, the legend of Roanoke grew more terrifying with each passing year. The island was no longer just a place on a map. It was a warning, a place that demanded silence, demanded respect, and, above all, demanded fear. Because there were those who believed the truth was out there, waiting, and those who sought it might never return. Time, like the tides, eroded all that was left of the Roanoke mystery, until the whispers became legends, fading from the forefront of most minds, drowned out by the ever-persistent march of history. But beneath the surface, the island itself refused to be forgotten. In the late 17th century, as the English colonies began to take root on the American mainland, the forgotten colony of Roanoke became a subject of occasional interest, still a curiosity, still a riddle, but no longer a pressing mystery. Yet, even as the passage of time dulled its urgency, the island's strange pull on the human imagination remained strong. The stories of Roanoke resurfaced in the early 1700s, propelled not by history but by something more insidious. By now, the lost colony was no longer just an unsolved puzzle. It had transformed into something darker, something dangerous. Rumors of strange happenings on Roanoke Island began to circulate once again. Fishermen spoke of seeing unnatural lights flickering along the shores. Those who had ventured too close in the night told of eerie sounds, low moans, whispers, laughter, sounds that were not human, sounds that made their skin crawl. And the woods. Oh, the woods. The woods were no longer just thick with trees. They seemed alive, watching, waiting. Some of the older, more experienced settlers in nearby colonies began to whisper about things they had seen in the wild, things they didn't speak of lightly. They told stories of shadows that didn't move with the wind, of figures that watched from the edges of the forest but never came close. They told of strange, haunting faces, faces that appeared in the mist, fleeting, too quick to be caught, but etched in the mind like the faintest memory of a dream. One particularly eerie story came from a ship's crew anchored off the coast of Roanoke in 1714. It was a quiet night, the sea calm, the air heavy with the scent of pine and salt. But there was something wrong. The men aboard the ship had heard the stories. Of course, every sailor knew of Roanoke and its ghostly legacy, but none of them had taken it seriously, dismissing it as superstition. Something to be laughed at when the taverns filled with men boasting of their exploits. That night, however, their bravado was tested. The wind was still, the sea flat as glass, but the air was heavy, thick with a presence that none of the men could explain. As they lay in their hammocks, some of the men began to hear things. Quiet at first, a rustle, a thump against the side of the ship, the creak of ropes moving against the mast as if touched by unseen hands. Then came the sounds, sharp, faint, like voices carried on the wind. They seemed to be calling out, distant, but so clear that the men could hear them, words in a language they could not place. A soft whisper, then a laugh, low and guttural, almost mocking. The hairs on their necks stood up, but they were men of the sea. They had weathered storms, seen strange sights before, and laughed off the fears of landlubbers. But when one of the sailors went missing the next morning, his body never found, the laughter stopped. The captain ordered the crew to sail away, to leave Roanoke behind, but it was too late. Several more men disappeared before they had even made it out of the sight of the island shores. As the ship vanished into the horizon, the whispers continued to echo in the sailors' minds. This was not the first instance of strange disappearances near Roanoke, but it was one of the most vivid. The island had claimed yet another chapter in its dark, twisted history. But this time, it was not the settlers who had vanished. It was the living. Those who had come to investigate, to uncover the truth, were now part of the island's legend, a warning to anyone who might come next. In the years that followed, the story of Roanoke became not just a mystery to solve, but a curse, one that hung over the land like a shroud, reaching out to claim anyone who dared to search for answers. The island became a place of legends and stories told around firesides. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as if merely uttering its name would invite something dark, something ancient, into their lives. They would say that Roanoke had never truly let go of its lost colony, that the land had absorbed them, consumed them, and now it was hungry again. Some said the colony's ghosts still walked the island, restless and searching for something, anything, to break the hold of the island's curse. Others whispered of figures in the shadows, watching from the edge of the woods, and sometimes, just sometimes, you would hear the faintest sound on the wind, a voice calling out in the night. It was always the same word, Croatoan, the same word left on the tree, the same word that had haunted the settlers from the very beginning, the word that was their final message, their final plea, or perhaps a warning, a cry for help to those who might come after them. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the terror and the disappearances, people still came. Explorers, treasure hunters, archaeologists, and those driven by a need to know, to understand. They were drawn by a force they couldn't explain, a need to find the truth no matter what the cost. And some of them, too, never came back. Some say they are still out there, lost to time and to the island, their voices mingling with the others, echoing on the wind, waiting for someone to uncover the truth, if anyone dares to listen. Roanoke Island had become more than just a place. It had become a legend, a warning, a riddle, a dark and twisted memory that refused to die. And as long as the island remained, as long as its eerie silence endured, the question would never be answered. What had happened to the Roanoke settlers? Was it murder, madness, or was there something else, something darker, lurking in the shadows? Perhaps the island would never tell. Or perhaps those brave or foolish enough to look would uncover something far worse than they ever imagined. Because Roanoke, it seemed, would never let go. Not of its secrets, not of its ghosts, and not of those who dared to ask. The years turned into centuries, and the mystery of Roanoke, though persistent, seemed to fade into myth. Yet, the island remained a place where only the brave, or the reckless, dared to venture. Every so often, the world would catch a glimpse of its shadow again, as someone new would set foot on the soil of Roanoke, seeking answers, seeking what no one had ever been able to uncover. And every time, the island would swallow them whole, as it had done with the first colony, leaving behind only echoes, rumors, and whispers of the vanished. By the late 19th century, Roanoke Island had become a relic of history, something tourists occasionally visited, their curiosity satisfied by small tokens of the past, faded remnants of a civilization long gone. But even now, there were those who felt it, that chilling presence. The air on Roanoke felt different from anywhere else. The trees seemed taller, darker, as though watching. The land felt colder, even on the warmest days. And when the wind picked up, carrying the faintest whispers through the pines, you could almost hear it. A voice, distant, ancient, calling, beckoning, waiting. Perhaps it was a belief in the curse that had kept the mystery alive. Or maybe it was a dread that still clung to the island like the fog that rolled in every evening. But the more the story of Roanoke was told, the more the island seemed to draw people to it. There was something about it that wouldn't let go, a force as old as the land itself, as eternal as the tides. In 1891, a man named Thomas Wentworth, a professor from a nearby college, became obsessed with the tale of Roanoke. He had read every book, sifted through every document, and listened to every rumor about the island. His curiosity consumed him, and against the warnings of his peers, he sailed to the island alone, determined to uncover its secrets once and for all. He took with him nothing but a journal, a lantern, and a deep sense of dread that he couldn't shake. Wentworth's journey began like many before him. He explored the ruins of the colony, the crumbling houses, the crooked foundations. Nothing new, nothing different from what had been found before. But as he ventured deeper into the woods, something changed. The trees grew denser, the air colder. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't the silence of a natural place. It was the silence of something waiting, and that waiting was the worst part. Thomas Wentworth never returned. His shipmates, upon realizing he had not come back to the ship at nightfall, waited for him, calling his name, searching the island's edges. But there were no signs, no sign of a struggle, no clues, just an eerie emptiness, the kind of emptiness that felt as though the island had swallowed him whole. They searched for days, but found nothing but the word Croatoan carved again. This time, not on a tree, but on the stone by the shore. The mystery was, once again, complete. Roanoke had taken another soul, and no one was left to explain why. As the years passed, and the stories of Roanoke continued to swirl in whispers, something became clear. The island would never give up its secret. There would be no discovery, no answer to the question that haunted so many. What happened to the lost colonists of Roanoke? Did they perish in the wilderness, victims of disease, starvation, or the wrath of the Croatoans? Or had they been swallowed by something darker, something older, something that the world was not ready to understand? Roanoke Island had become more than just a geographical location. It had become a legend, a place where the living mingled with the dead, where time and history blurred, where reality and myth collided. The island had a hunger, and that hunger would never be sated until it had taken everything it could. And so, the mystery endures. As you sit here today, listening to the tale of Roanoke, ask yourself, are you ready to uncover the truth? Are you willing to venture into the unknown, to walk through the woods where the settlers once stood, where shadows move just out of sight, where whispers follow you no matter how far you run? The island still waits, its secrets buried deep beneath the earth, beneath the trees, beneath the very air you breathe. But be warned, once the island calls you, there may be no turning back. The lost colony still lingers, still echoes through the woods, still whispers its secrets to those who listen too closely. And maybe, just maybe, you will be the one to uncover them. But then again, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll disappear, like so many before you. The island has no mercy, and it never lets go. As the mystery of Roanoke endures, the questions it raises continue to resonate. What happened to the settlers of Roanoke? Was it the land, the people, or something far darker? These questions remain unanswered, buried in the sands of time and the deep, dark woods of the island. But the legend continues to capture the imagination of anyone who hears it. If this tale intrigued you, if the mystery of Roanoke has left you haunted, don't let it slip away. Subscribe to our channel for more unsettling stories, more mysteries that time has left unsolved. There are so many secrets out there, stories waiting to be uncovered, mysteries waiting to be solved. And if you've got the courage to search for answers, join us. We'll take you to the places where the past is never really gone. So hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share this story with someone who isn't afraid to face the unknown. And leave a comment below. What do you think happened to the lost colony? Have you ever been to Roanoke? Or is it a place too terrifying to visit? Stay curious, stay brave, and never forget, the world is filled with stories that demand to be told. Until next time, remember, some mysteries are meant to stay hidden, but some are meant to find you.